This is the Ideas Podcast, the show where learning and development professionals discuss ideas over a nice cup of tea. Warning, other beverages may be consumed. In this episode, I chat with Sonia Tiwari, a learning experience designer working in the world of children's education, something very different for this show. We discuss the key differences and similarities and the role technology plays in the world of children's education. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ideas Podcast. With me today is Dr Sonia Tiwari, who is an LXD for children's learning, which is something we've never discussed on this show before. So this is going to be really interesting. I've usually at least got one foot in what we're talking about. This I know practically nothing about. So this will be very interesting indeed. As always, before we get started though, the real reason everyone tunes in is to find out as we chat what we are drinking. So, Sonia, what have you got?
Just water. Actually, I take small breaks and just water.
That's fair enough. We're undergoing a small heat wave here in the UK, so we're predominantly the same. But I thought I would splash out and get a can of Pepsi for this. That's what splashing out in summer in Britain looks like. Fantastic. So, as I mentioned at the start of the episode, we're in the world. We're talking about the world of learning experience design, but perhaps in a context that certainly I'm not that familiar with it in, and I think a lot of my listeners won't be. But that is children's education. Before we dive into what those differences are, I'll hand over to you for a bit more of a sort of well-rounded introduction.
Hey everyone, I'm Sonia. I started with like a bachelor's in film. I've always been interested in storytelling. And then I just needed more freedom and creativity, so got interested in animation. And then worked in the San Francisco Bay Area as a game designer and UX designer. And in one of the places where I worked, they had a dedicated research team. And it was just fascinating to see the decision making behind the design choices that we were making. So that's how I got interested in research. And then I got my PhD in learning design and technology, where I focused on children's educational products. I was already in the children's design space, so I thought it would be nice to see the back end from a research angle in the same space.
That's awesome. I think it's lots to talk about there separately. We'll start with the LXD stuff. I definitely want to talk more about kind of the film and animation stuff as well, because that sounds really interesting. But let's dive straight into that as our first question, I guess. We're kind of more and more, I would say, within the corporate L&D space, kind of talking about what is LXD versus instructional design versus content development and all these other very internally looking conversations about ourselves, which is possibly not a great thing to spend our time on anyway. But setting that aside, what is the kind of real difference between doing that in a corporate L&D setting, or even a higher education setting, to doing that for specifically children?
I think there's more opportunity for informal and creative learning experiences, because in higher ed, it's mostly something inside of an LMS or like an AR or VR experience. There are just like very few handful of variations that you can imagine, and not to deny like innovative designers in the higher ed space, of course, but it's the variations are fewer. Versus in, I think, the children's space, it's all open, like people create library experiences, immersive installations at museums, informal summer camps and after school camps, and even like in-class experiences can look very different than higher ed. And plus, we're just talking about a completely different learner population. Children don't learn in the same way as an independent adult would. And the learning theories, like there is some underlying grammar that's common across any age group, learning in general. But then again, as instructional designers, learning designers, we cater to the learner specifically and children are just a very different audience. So we also have to take a very different approach.
Cool. So, sort of something I've noticed as I've kind of made an effort over maybe the last maybe 5 or 6 years to be much more kind of evidence informed as I've tried to work in the field is how much of the sort of body of properly done research out there, or academic research, is done that does focus on sort of school-based learning in children as opposed to workplace learning. Um, and I think part of that is probably just because our industry is a little bit, I wouldn't say lazy, but reticent to conduct proper research. We like white papers that predominantly just sell us LMSs. Um,
Right.
so I know a sort of big part, having looked at, having lurked around your website and had a good look about, a big part of what you talk about is being evidence informed. And I'm just wondering, when you see the kind of, I say we have to adapt a lot of research when we look at it from a workplace learning perspective. It's not kind of like a direct one for one, do this and you'll see that. Do you see something similar when working with sort of in your area of the business, or is that research a little more accessible because it's more focused on that kind of age range?
Some are similar. I think like if you create a study which is very close to the literature that you read, like for example, there's a lot of research on informal STEM learning in after school camps and working with toy robots and or working with Scratch Junior. And so if you're creating a study very close to that, you can expect some of the similar results, or at least have some idea going in what might show up. But again, if you're trying something new and innovative, it's always completely new territory, and you have to kind of take this applied insights. And the thing about case studies is that it doesn't generate 100% generalizable insights. So there's always like some inspiration, but then with the demographic of the audience and the situation, it just you might see something completely unexpected. So as a researcher, I guess across both higher ed and K-12, um, you just have to try to be inspired but also unbiased. Sometimes in academia, after reading a bunch of studies, people go in expecting something that, oh, I designed, and no researcher ever confesses, in at least in an academic publication, that I designed an intervention and it was not successful. It's always like, oh, there was definitely an increase in learning and engagement, and this is how it was awesome, and everyone loved it. So I like to take this like neutral approach. It's kind of like journalism. You have to stay unbiased. That's the true mark of a journalist.
It's really interesting. There's a company here, a sort of small company in the UK called Solve Together, and I spoke to other people there a little while ago, and they kind of when they work with a client, they talk about the first stage is experimentation. It's conducting a series of experiments about what works with your particular user base.
Yeah.
And so that kind of really sounds like it sits quite well with this, in that view of, look, there are 3 things that might be the right way to go. The only way to actually find out is to do it and get some results.
Right. So that's
Um,
why the people who design the product, sometimes if they are too heavily engaged in the research as well, that is when a lot of bias creeps in, because like, oh, we've been working so hard on this thing, this toy robot or this game or whatever that we designed.
yeah.
And so then research becomes kind of a marketing tool more than an insight tool. So, and for kids, even more so, because that's such a young audience, they can't defend themselves. Like grown up learners, they can challenge it that, you say that, learning improves by such and such percentage, but I don't see any difference. And kids can challenge that back. So you see a lot of lies in the promotional materials of educational products targeted at children. Um, yeah.
I think upsettingly, we still see a lot of them in those targeted at professional L&D people as well. I know we can, generally speaking, we should be more able to argue back, but whether or not we all do is another question, I suppose. Uh,
Yeah.
but so I think something that kind of struck me when I was looking at the kind of work you've done is that usually when I look at kind of instructional designers, people creating content in our space, we get the kind of, storyline and rise and evolve and that kind of thing. Kind of the first thing I bumped into in your work was stuff built in Unity. Um, and it was actually this really sort of, in fact, it was, what was it, the microbes
Yeah.
journey, I think it was. Awesome, by the way. I'll put a link in the website to Sonia's website. Most fun I've had all weekend trying to remember this stuff from school. But really nicely built. And I think something that in the adult space, it would kind of be going, oh, this is frivolous. This doesn't add anything to the learning and all that kind of stuff, which I've always found is a little bit sad. As someone who loves comic books and cartoons as an adult, I kind of go, well, why am I not allowed to like that stuff still?
Right.
So in the world of kind of children's education, is that much more accepted as being effective and worth the time to develop?
Definitely, because that's the selling point for a lot of these content creators and companies. Like ABC Mouse is one of the biggest websites in children's educational space, and it's all like game-based learning and all animated characters. And so even like Khan Academy or Brilliant.org, Brilliant is
Mm.
actually aimed at adults, and that also helps people learn visually through animation and interaction. So I think it's catching on, or even I think it's TED Learning, TEDx Learning. I forget.
Okay.
Yeah, they also have all these like beautiful animated mini documentaries on different topics. Um, that's again like aimed at both children and adults. So I think this kind of creative modality of learning is catching on to all aspects. Like the blue background with yellow fonts does not cut it anymore.
Absolutely. No, that's really good to hear because I think it has been a frustration. I think in the corporate space that there's still this hesitance around, oh, it looks childish, or oh, it doesn't work. There's no backing for that. So it's nice to see that it's at least gaining some ground in children's education. So when you go about creating that kind of content, I mean, where do you even start? Because it's obviously going to be quite different to the maybe quite I'd assume quite different to the process that me or my team might follow when creating something about, I don't know, GDPR or something incredibly dull like that for a compliance piece.
I work very closely with educators or caregivers, whoever is spending a lot of time with my target audience. And so generally they will give some pointers as to like where do children need help. So for example, there was a pre-K school that was really struggling in terms of their academic performance. And so I asked the teacher like which module are the children struggling with the most, and she was like, "Oh, it's fractions. It's they're having a hard time, and it happens every year." So she had some data to already built in, so it was very easy to identify the topic. And so it was generally they teach that topic around Halloween. So then I had this idea, okay, why don't I make whatever learning experience Halloween themed, so that children, will have some fun, and the school is already decorated in the same theme. And so I created a board game called Bricksters, and it was uh, it's kind of like shoots and ladders, but instead of the ladders, you kind of add a bunch of Lego bricks, and the snake is you remove the bricks. So you're visually adding and subtracting from a tower of Lego as you go as you play the board game. And then they also saw some Halloween themed, buying candy, sharing candy type of short stories. So they had like the video to kind of give them an orientation of the topic, and the board game to sort of practice what they learned. Because, visually being able to compare two Lego brick towers is kind of the foundational skills that they need to then understand fractions and adding and subtracting visually. that, half of this tower is this much. So then they start to translate it into numbers as they grow older. So all these kind of insights came from the teachers, really, because they use Lego bricks in class to teach about adding, subtracting, other things with numbers. So again, like, I try to leverage on systems that are already built in, topics where they're already struggling. And so, otherwise, what happens is sometimes in academia, especially, some professor will get like a grant from some science foundation and they have to fulfill the grant and it has to be around certain topics. So, whether or not a child needs help, the intervention is designed like, oh, it's going to be STEM and it's going to be coding and it's going to be Scratch, but they're kind of already good at it. So, do you really need to design a special study? So that's been the real challenge, that, collaborating with, and I think it's similar for higher ed. Like, you collaborate with the subject matter expert, and they'll sort of tell you where the students are struggling or where they need help. So in that sense, it's similar.
Yeah, I must admit, I think obviously a lot of the if you looked at who you talk to, there'd be a different person, but actually it's not as dissimilar as I might have expected. I think especially that kind of leveraging. We talk a lot about meeting your learners where they are these days, and that's kind of exactly that, leveraging what they're already using and where the existing challenges are. And I can certainly relate to the idea of, well, no one needs this, but we're building it anyway.
Right.
We see a lot of that. That's the vast majority of e-learning in the corporate space. Unfortunately, falls into that category still. It's like, you didn't need this course, and we know that, but here it is anyway.
Yeah, it could
Money has been
be.
spent.
Yeah, what could have been an image or a meme is now a VR
Mm.
experience. So
Well, yes, yeah, that's so that'd be interesting actually. 'Cause seeing kind of the range of technology that you're using, I am very vocal in my not sureness around VR.
yeah.
Like, I'm on board with AR. I can totally see the value in it. VR seems very complex, very expensive, and even when I speak to the vendors, I'm like, "Can you tell me how it's better than any other form of learning for something?" And it's like, "No, not really." Um, which has been a little bit upsetting considering they're trying to sell it to me. So I'd love to hear, with kind of, again, different setting, different audience. What are you seeing or doing with VR, and what are your thoughts on where it is at the moment?
I think it's like, if in a specific use case where it's genuinely helpful to see something in a 360 kind of environment. And again, like, to me, whether it's like children as an audience or adults, it just depends on the case. So, for example, this is not
Mm.
related to children's media, but in one of my jobs at the university was to support the nursing program. And some of the other designers in my team, what they had done was created a home inspection VR, like, 360 experience, where the nurses could inspect the in-home patient care. So just look around for any signs that could be hazardous, like a burning candle or a cable on the floor, and then identify them. And they would get instant feedback whether they were able to inspect something very well or not. And I thought it was really innovative, especially during COVID, where generally they do it in person, but then they had this VR experience because they couldn't. So I thought that was a really nice use of VR. And then, again, like the TV show Cosmos, where, you're like just traveling through time and space, and those kind of VR experiences are, again, like fascinating things you can't see in real life. And even with AR, I think it's beneficial to sometimes shut off the reality 100%. So any experience that requires that to completely transport yourself into a time and space that does not require reality, then it's beneficial. And as with any kind of media, it just has to be curated and time limited. You can't just, strap that thing on your head forever. Like a 15-minute experience in class exploring something from history or space is fine. Um, So and then following it up with actual discussions, as you know, with any other media. It's like, you know, people watch a master class and think, yeah, I've mastered the skill. But again, it's more about how you apply those skills and practice and improve. And maybe you know, like I'm guilty of that too. Like I've seen a lot of master classes on writing, and that was just like me
Mm.
procrastinating the actual writing. But then eventually I have to like close all the tabs, and then just, you know, go and write. So it's similar with VR. You experience it, but then what do you do with it is the learning.
Yeah, that's really it's fair enough. You saying about kind of Cosmos there. Obviously, we're getting all these incredible images back right now,
Right.
which I guess. Oh, I would hope schools are jumping on that, because I was lucky enough that some of those amazing pictures from the Hubble telescope came out when I was at school, and but by comparison, I remember one teacher who was very excited about it came in with a big poster of it. That's what we got. He put a big poster on the wall, and we gathered round it to look at it and talk about what it might be.
Right.
And I thought that, again, it's one of those things where I'd never really thought about it in an educational setting. That would be a phenomenal, I think, use case of it, to be able to really get in and interact with those kinds of images that I think otherwise are quite difficult to engage with. They're amazing, but when someone goes, it's X many billion light years away, and you're like, I have no frame of reference for what that means. Like that.
Also,
But you may as well just say it's a long way away. That's it's the same thing to me.
and like in the
So I think being
when you see the like the ring around Saturn, for example, I was actually much older when I realized that, oh, it's just gas. Like it's not like a solid ring that you can slide on. So those kind of like material details that you need to zoom in and explore for yourself. That, oh, it's just like, or like clouds are not solid, for instance. Like very young kids think they're, because in children's book you see like characters sitting on it, and you know, so those kind of details that require close inspection are again better in VR, which is not, even if you did like a video explaining the different properties, just experiencing it the way children naturally do is just easy to remember.
So that's kind of, it's kind of brought a question to my mind there. We at the minute I'm doing a lot of kind of talking with people and sort of trying to get towards maybe doing some research around freedom in learning, because we have a bit of a problem in a lot of workplaces where people are very much in the sense of just give them the information, let them get back to work, and in theory that's great, but sometimes it doesn't work. So I'm trying to figure out what benefit there is to going explore this content. And it sounds like that's a little bit of what you're talking about in education. But I know sort of my experience and the experience where I have worked with a very limited number of educational places as a learning designer have been very kind of directive, maybe in a more classic style of teaching. So is that something that you're seeing change, or is it something you would like to see change versus it's actually happening, or where do we stand there?
So I'll name drop this amazing researcher, Dr. Keith Sawyer, and he has this term called structured improvisation. And he's a jazz musician, so he uses that as an example that, you know, jazz has again like this underlying architecture, but then there's a lot of improvisation. The musicians kind of have a live interaction with the audience. They read the mood in the room, and they, you know, change the flavor. So they do have rehearsals, and they do have some notations as the basic guide. But then on top of it, it's always different. It's never, two performances are never the same. And so Keith kind of argues that it's similar with learning, that if you have a syllabus, sure, have like a loose guideline, but then leave room for exploration and improvisation. So I think that's a good balance, because if you leave it completely free that, oh, go explore, it will be chaos. Especially, you know, in many classrooms, there are way too many students. So I even wrote an article about like the inequity in children's education. So if you are rich and can afford private school education, there are just like 3 or 4 children and one teacher. So you can get this one-on-one attention. Let me create an adaptive tailored, customized syllabus just to you, Timmy. And then, in public school, it's like chaos, like 20, 30 children in a class. And I'm originally from India. And when I grew up, at one point, there were 70 students in a class and just one teacher, just like the amount of our population. So within that, they do need an extremely structured syllabus because they don't have the time or energy to tailor it or leave room for exploration. And neither those many resources. Like if they had a VR headset, they'll have just one. So it's hard to like share them. So it's a lot of equity issues in trying to uh, make it exploration. That's why like the instructional design, when it originated in the army, it was for mass training because they didn't have time for individual stuff. Of course,
Mm.
since then, ID has evolved and we are no longer operating in that military mentality. So now there is room. But again, it depends on the resources you have access to.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting thing. You're touching on the inequity side of it there. We'll pop a link to that article in the in the show notes, because then that's it's an interesting topic that I think maybe gets overlooked a little bit too often, shall we say? Um, I think especially as it's very easy to critique from a distance. But you're exactly right. I think in the corporate world, we often go in that we have very few resources. We have a lot more resources at our disposal than many classrooms realistically.
Yeah.
Um, so another thing that's kind of growing, I guess, is the idea of this kind of serious play. Whether it's obviously Lego, I think really helped push this. The Lego serious play movement was fantastic. Obviously very facilitation heavy. Now we're seeing, I think, a lot more by the way of kind of video game elements being pulled in. I don't think I've yet seen like a really good actual what you would call a video game where you also learn. I think there have been some attempts, but none of them have rivaled Halo yet for me. Anyway, that's just not quite at that level. Are you seeing sort of similar stuff or doing similar things in schools? Is that kind of, I don't know, still in the early stage as it is in corporate?
I think I'm a little bit skeptical about the research that's coming out from a lot of these tech innovators in education
Mm.
space because, like I was saying, that sometimes corporate research tends to be more marketing focused than fact focused. It's like, oh, trust, like 90% of the parents said that they agreed with this approach, but like we don't know how many people you really surveyed and is this what they actually felt. So I'm really skeptical because in universities, there's the institutional review board or some other third party kind of reviewing the process. In the industry, we should be mindful about who we're trusting, and so it's always about moderation from the part of caregivers and educators. Don't just take the word of the creators. Try it out yourself. And it's really hard for parents because there is like a generation gap. For example, like I have a 9-year-old and he's obsessed with Roblox and Minecraft. And I'll be honest, I don't fully understand these platforms. Like I've read studies about them and I play I've explored Minecraft in creative mode and tinkered around, but I wouldn't call myself an expert. And so sometimes it's hard to understand their world, and sometimes there's this reliance on all these Nike and Disney and all other big players in the children's fashion and education and entertainment space. Now they are creating Roblox experiences, and ideally as a parent I should be reviewing it first, but then sometimes because I don't understand it, I just ask my son, so how was it, what do you think? And that is kind of dangerous sometimes. So there also needs to be training for the parents to understand this new world. And I think the equivalent of that in higher education is all these like long timey IDs sometimes don't catch up to the new tools. So for example, for 360 videos, if you already have like a Creative Cloud subscription from Adobe, then Adobe Captivate is really fairly easy to learn, like in a day. Like I generally teach over like a course of like a 2-3 hour workshop. And if you're already aware of like other LMS tools like Storyline, it's fairly easy to catch on. So that is the equivalent of a parent feeling out of place, is like traditional IDs feeling out of place every time there's like a new tool or new technology. And sometimes that comes in the way of creativity. And I've seen like design challenges of like design icons in PowerPoint. I'm like, what? Why? Like, it's like, oh, can you use a Lamborghini as a taxi? Sure, you can, but should you?
Okay, yeah, oh, I like that. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? There seems to be a real kind of I don't know, a weird excitement about using a tool for something it's just not meant to do.
Right, right.
Like I've always quite liked the idea of a tool does one job very well, so use it for that, and then get a tool that does the other thing really well. But I think I had this chat with someone the other week, and their kind of counter argument to it was, I haven't got that much money, which is okay. That's fair enough. You want to try and find the does it all tool, I guess.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, if it's an equity case,
but
it's different. But if you do have access to the other softwares which are already more
mm,
powerful, then it's kind of, and it's similar for parents. Like I grew up with really like Super Mario and Prince of Persia, and for me to catch on to the more advanced games, or the games that are popular today, it's hard to keep up with the. Yeah, there's definitely a generation gap that creeps up if you're not constantly investing time to learn it.
definitely, it's like a long time ago I worked in IT, and now I've got a very young nephew who is very very good with touchscreen devices, and I'm there going, nope, no idea. This is which is you gotta go, wow, how did I get here? I used to be the member of this family that showed people how to do this stuff. What's happened?
Right. And we
Um,
wear glasses
one
every
thing you
day.
mentioned earlier was kind of really thinking about who we trust with where we get our information.
Right.
And I feel like this is one of the biggest challenges. It's certainly in the corporate space around the whole evidence informed design shift. Because I think a lot of people don't know how to, if it's a piece of research, it must be true, right? That's why it's research as opposed to just a blog or whatever. And I know for me, it took quite a while to kind of get to grips with the idea of how do I assess what I should listen to, what I shouldn't, what the limitations of this might be. I just wondered if you could kind of give us some insight into what you do in terms of assessing, is this something worth sort of putting into my thinking about a possible solution? How do you assess research sources?
So I tried to look at where the funding is coming from, and if the source of funding has any interest in the findings. Will it support them if the research
Okay.
is in their favor? That's a very clear give. So if Disney is saying that they publish a research that says Disney media is more beneficial for children than the other, like than Sony, um, and Disney funded this research, I'll be like, what? Of course you'll say that. But if it's like Common Sense Media or like a third party organization is doing this kind of research and reviewing parents, and their reviews are public, so you can go and check how did they come up with this research, then I will trust it. So you kind of have to look at the source. Uh, what are they going to gain if the research goes in their favor? And so all the research statistics that are behind the product itself, like you buy a toothpaste and it says, oh, research says this is the better one. I don't trust that. I would rather trust an Amazon review or like something which is like public. Um, so yeah,
Mm.
that's like my number one test. And the second is to try it myself. If it's like something not risky, then to try the media myself, especially if it's aimed at children and you can't leave the review process to them. So I always have the teacher or a parent have it review before, because sometimes children have specific triggers that the content creators may not be aware of, and so it's important for the caregivers and educators to kind of review it for them.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually, is that even though maybe the actual research that's been done is sound, it doesn't mean it's applicable to your audience.
Right.
And I feel like maybe that's where I think we run into a lot of issues with things where we think we've been evidence informed, but in actually we've just done what the research did to a completely different group of people. And then instead they're going, how has this not worked? It makes no sense. So I think that's really helpful.
There's
I think,
also
it's something that
Gary Pope. He is a very a prominent personality in children's media space. He's the co-founder of Kids Industries, and so he also pointed out something similar. He was talking about how there's like a kid-friendly metaverse that's being valued at $32 billion, and he was questioning if this kind of crazy valuation, wouldn't you be better off putting even half of that towards actual education and not a pseudo learning experience? And that was really powerful, because it is a huge amount. Like, a lot of public schools are in such bad shape. Even a fraction of that amount would just change everything. And so all these big companies who are investing big time in a kid-safe metaverse, and you can try on virtual shoes in the some virtual version. That to me seems unfair, kind of. Or it should be some kind of like social entrepreneurship model, like those companies that, we make these socks and we donate a sock to the orphan who made these socks in the first place. So it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be like a weird cycle. But it should be like, if we hit this mark in profits, we are going to fund these many public schools or something like that. Then I can get behind this. But right now, it just feels outrageous, the kind of valuations these big companies are able to get, and how are they even getting all these investors? And the metaverse is not even technically here. It's like it exists in parts. It's just still an imagination of what could be. And just based on that, I don't know if you've seen the TV show Silicon Valley. It's like a
yes.
Yeah. So it's kind of like that. A product that doesn't even exist has been sold already.
Yeah, it always I find it very interesting that every conference now there is someone going the metaverse and how it's going to revolutionize learning and development. So I'm thinking, really?
Yeah.
Really? Like, are you serious? Like, so I remember in my time in the business, we've had we've got metaverse. Before that, we had the VR revolution. Not seeing much of that. Then we had the game revolution. Not seeing much of that. Then mobile. No one was ever going to learn at a desk again. Everyone would learn on their mobile phones. Well, that didn't happen either.
Right.
The simple fact is, all these revolutions, they just haven't happened. And I think it's a lot of what you said. They're products that are they're technically impressive, like amazing stuff. But that's not actually what we do. We don't just make stuff to go, wow, isn't this impressive? Like, it is about learning at the end of the day, whether it's for kids, adults, higher education pupils, whoever it might be. And I feel like sometimes that gets lost in the excitement. And I think the metaverse is just the most recent example of that. I think for most of us currently, the metaverse is a Facebook product.
Right.
I'm not going to get that excited about that. Sorry.
Right.
It's just another Facebook product. And interestingly, along with that, kind of the investment side of things, something me and Joey Sennett have commented on a couple of times on the ID update now is that we're seeing massive consolidation in who is actually providing edtech. So eLearning Brothers have bought like 3 or 4 companies so far this year. So we're actually seeing, although we're seeing new products, we're kind of seeing this reduction in who is providing the products. And that makes me slightly nervous because I think consolidation in the industry is never good. You know, you want, well, certainly I would want to see different people competing and innovating and having to create real valuable stuff so that we choose them rather than a couple of big businesses. I mean, well, we're just heading for the same place we are with other technology, I think, where are you Apple or are you Samsung? There you go. That's when buying a phone, and the vast majority of people, let's say 50-60% of people, fall into one of those two categories.
Right.
A couple of us weirdos buy Google phones, and then, there's a smattering of other stuff. But I think it'd be really sad to see that happen to the edtech space, because not so long ago, it was very vibrant. There was a lot of different stuff coming out.
I'm hopeful. I think there still will be, just like in the media space, there was a time where, there were like 2 or 3 major networks, television networks. No one even uses that term anymore. Now it's like all streaming. And so even like with YouTube, like the comedian Lily Singh, for instance, many years ago when I saw her YouTube channel, I was like, she's funny. And like there's this girl from Canada just, making home videos, being funny. And now she has her own late night show. So I think just there's democracy now. So that is what I appreciate, that there's no 2 or 3 television networks anymore. There are so many platforms. So what you're describing, like, I think it's the beginning of that journey again, that in the beginning, there will be monopoly, and then there will be people who will challenge it. And then at one point, there will be way too many platforms. And then people will start, relying on these reviews and rating systems to find, like we used to go to the local grocery store and there were like 4 options. And now we have like a whole cereal aisle full of flavors. So it's going to be that way. And now it's coming back, if you look at any kind of diet, it's kind of bringing you back to, fewer options. Look at the ingredients, fewer ingredients. You don't need those many. So it will come. I think it's cyclical in that sense, that there's, first there's monopoly, then there are way too many players, then you begin curation, and then it's kind of a decent democracy.
Yeah, I like that. That's a hopeful outlook. Hopeful is never my default, but you never know. This might be the time.
And also, like, in terms of understanding whether an idea will work in the metaverse or whatever the new bells and whistles are, like you were saying, that every few years there's something new, shiny. I have this mantra that if something is lame in print, in writing, it will also be lame in VR and AR and any other medium. So correct the lameness before you switch the medium. So that's I think all IDs would agree that the technology comes second and the content is key.
Yeah, that's it. I think kind of the reverse of that is what we've seen over the past few years, where for obvious reasons, everything has been this mad rush, get it online, make it digital, make it interactive.
Right.
And no one stopped to go, should we not just delete this because it's rubbish? Is this not an opportunity to just replace it altogether? Which hopefully now I think is starting to happen.
Yeah, I joke that it's kind of like spraying Febreze on a skunk. If it stinks, no amount of perfume is gonna solve it. So.
Like that, yeah. That's so there is a term I've used for that at a conference before, but we keep the podcast PG rated so it doesn't get delisted on Apple Podcasts. So we shan't use that phrase here, but people will probably know what I mean. Something to do with what you put in versus what you get out of a piece of content.
Right.
But so we're coming up pretty hard on the end of the hour. But one thing I always really enjoy and learn a lot from asking people is, right now, when you look at your prospective industry, what is it that you see that you're excited about and want to do next?
I think the quality of content, because there's just so much noise right now, that I appreciate that the goal audience, which is the educators, caregivers, children, even children have a really good taste in design, and they're very refined because, for example, we grew up with fewer options, so our bar wasn't that high. Now children have seen such variety of content that even they recognize quality content, just the visual, the story, even the voiceover, tiny details. So that is what I'm excited about. That it's a good way to cut the noise. If you're just genuine and if you're creating good content, you'll have a place.
Fantastic. No, I like that. That's a positive shift for everyone, I think, in the long run, at least. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for making the time to come and talk with me and share your views. I know we could probably talk for an awful lot longer, and there's so much interesting stuff here. But assuming people do have more questions, where can they find you and where can they get in touch?
Well, I'm active on LinkedIn, so that would be the best place to reach out. And if you just want to look at my work, it's my website, soniatiwari.com.
Definitely check that out. We'll have links to all of that in the show notes. As I said, I would definitely recommend taking a look at the microbe journey piece. I thought it was fantastic. Really, really, really good fun, and certainly tested my memory, I can tell you. But thank you so much once again for joining us on the show, and we shall see everyone else next time. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Ideas Podcast. Please let us know what you're taking away from this conversation down in the comments, and if you enjoyed it, hit that like button. Also, please consider sharing this episode with someone in your network you think will gain something from it. Until next time, have a great day.